And the time is 7:45 South Africa time. A big welcome to everyone who's watching us this evening on a rather chilly evening in Johannesburg. Herschel Jarvis, it's 10 degrees outside. Have you wandered out?
Howie, I have, and I've actually just come from a rainy, dark, and cold Cape Town. So actually, the crisp, cold air of the Highveld is somewhat of a relief.
Well, it's not often we compete and win against Cape Town, so I suppose we must be grateful. It is still, though, a magnificent city. Even if it's in its wet and drizzle, it doesn't have potholes to accumulate the water.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I was joking at a meeting today, it's the separatist enclave of Cape Town. But I'll tell you how, we'll hear from our guests and your panel discussion tonight. So, you can be immune from potholes, and you can be immune to stage 4 load shedding when they're sitting at stage 3. But what you can't be immune to is a weakening exchange rate that affects everyone. You can't be immune to high inflation and high interest rates. And so, for the first time, I have a sense that Cape Town realizes that, what's happening in this country at a national and international level is impacting on them just as much as it's impacting on the rest of us around the country.
So, Hirsch, you're in the property game. We always refer to you as a property guru, and you generally blush when we say that. But has this had a positive impact? Are we seeing the Europeans and the Americans saying, well, look at nearly 20 to the dollar and 24 something to the pound, this is the time to invest in South Africa? Or are we seeing people just too nervous to put money here?
I think we probably see a combination of both. It's interesting. Sometimes I do think that we're our own worst critics, and looking from afar, things look a whole lot better than either they are or we think they are. So we're still seeing foreigners coming in, and the kind of obvious thought process is that the weaker the exchange, the more people come in. But we are starting to see some caution. We are starting to hear more questions. And we are starting to see somewhat of a more wait-and-see approach.
And within residential property in South Africa, and I see Jakkie Cilliers has joined us from Sweden, I think, Jakkie. I saw you flitter on the screen for a second, and I hope your camera's working. But we've seen quite a bit of immigration out of South Africa. The story I'm telling everyone, Mark Harmon is saying the sound has gone. Herschel, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm good. I can hear you clearly.
Okay, so Mark, I think that's on your side. So Mark, please look and see if you need to adjust anything. But my Uber driver, for example, on Saturday evening was saying, you know, she wants to go live in Atlanta. She's saving up money. She works at Old Mutual, but she's saving up money to go to Atlanta because she wants to immigrate to Atlanta. Now, when your Uber driver is talking to you about immigration, you know, you've probably hit the rock bottom. As someone said to me, you hit the rock bottom, and Jakkie, I think we keep on digging in South Africa.
That's very true.
But talk to me, Hirsch, about property prices in Johannesburg. Are we seeing any movement at all, or is everything suppressed because there's so much stock on the market?
So I think probably the latter statement is correct, Howard, and it's a very tough market for sellers to understand and to accept. And as you said, you know, we probably hit rock bottom. The hardest conversation we're having with our sellers in Johannesburg at the moment is, where is the bottom? So there is activity, there are sales taking place, but if you're a seller at the moment, and if you've bought your house in the last 5 to 10 years, it's really challenging. And you're probably, certainly in the last 5 years, you're not getting your money back, and we're starting to see that stretching back almost to 10 years. So if you know, inflation is sitting at roughly 6.8% now across the whole of Gauteng and most of the country, other than a few enclaves, there is no real growth. In fact, in real terms, house prices are declining. So that's one issue. And then when you look at the replacement cost, whether you're semigrating down to the Cape, or you're immigrating, or you're making Aliyah, you know, that's one of the toughest parts of the equation. It's not only what you're getting here, but it's the replacement cost of what you're going to have to pay for the same or less, that in most cases is at a minimum double and triple.
So Jakkie Cilliers, you're in Sweden at the moment. What on earth are you doing there? I see the sun shining through the windows behind you. Have we got midnight sun yet?
No. My I hate the South African winter, and my wife is Swedish, so we have a little summer house in Blekinge in the south of Sweden. So we flee here sort of end of May and then return to South Africa beginning of August. Nice and warm and sunny.
I have never heard before, nor did I ever think I would hear people go to Sweden for the weather.
Yes, summers in Sweden are beautiful. Blue skies, warm, long days. It's absolutely magnificent.
And can you do everything remotely? Do you work remotely from there?
Yeah. So I carry on working as I do in South Africa, except, you know, I go to the office normally in South Africa, maybe twice a week. The rest of the time I work at home in any case. No difference. It's just a bit further away, and the weather is much nicer. I can go and cycle and walk in the woods and so on. So that's very nice.
So for those people watching us, and we're going to start at 8 o'clock, so we've got about 7 minutes before we begin. But for those people watching us who've never experienced the midnight sun, explain to us what that's like.
Well, we don't get that. I'm in the south of Sweden, in Blekinge. If you know your map, that's about in line with Malmö, with Copenhagen. So it's in the south of Sweden. So you have to fly, 2 hours to Stockholm, and then another. Well, and there you can start seeing the midnight sun. I've actually been in the Arctic Circle in a place called Svalbard years ago, which is part of Norway.
That's far north. I was in Tromsø in Norway, and the boat comes comes to collect you, to take you to Svalbard, way into the Arctic Circle.
Yes, and that is fantastic. I mean, there you can see, well, you can see how the ice is melted, and you have 24-hour-a-day sun. So down here, we don't exactly see that. This part of Sweden gets a little bit of snow, for example, in winter. But I mean, let's face it, in the winter, Sweden is a miserable place because it's dark and it's cold and it's wet and it's icy and so on. So I have the best of worlds, summer in sunny South Africa, I stay in Pretoria, and then summer in the south of Sweden. So that's very nice.
I was in Pretoria for coffee yesterday morning, and let me tell you, it was a warm, fantastic day in Pretoria yesterday.
Excellent.
You can't beat Pretoria's weather, actually.
Well, Joburg is I used to say in Joburg's always a degree or two cooler because it's a bit higher. So Johannesburg is actually got excellent weather. It's not as warm. Pretoria lies in a bit of a kommetjie. So Pretoria can get quite hot.
I shouldn't ask you this question, but was something happening in Sweden this week? Because Stephen Grues from the South African Institute of International Affairs, I know, was in Sweden as well. Was there a big conference or something?
The week before last, there was a big security conference, which I attended in Stockholm. So I attended that. It's run by SIPRI, the Stockholm International Research Peace Institute. A lot of discussion on Ukraine and all of that kind of stuff. So I attended that, and then came down south to start with my working holiday, or whatever you want to call it. But I don't know. Stephen was probably here for something, something else. He works with SIA. He's gone back to SIA, if I'm correct.
The South African Institute of International Affairs, yes.
Yes.
That beautiful Jan Smuts House building on Wits campus. I still have fantasies about that building.
Is Sweden a member of NATO? Did I read this week that they are looking
They're trying to join, but
Erdogan is correct.
They're trying to join. You know that Finland has joined, which has got a long border. But Sweden is trying to join, but they haven't managed yet because Erdogan, who's just been re-elected in Turkey, is stopping them because he says the Swedes are supporting terrorists, which means they supporting human rights in Turkey, yeah. So, I mean, Sweden, which used to be really a neutral country during the Cold War, and was a huge supporter of the ANC, by the way. It was a larger supporter of the ANC than Russia, or than the former Soviet Union in monetary terms. And today, of course, the ANC want nothing to do with Sweden, well, not nothing, that's overstating it. They're very much looking towards Russia. And the Swedes are perplexed, because they were the main supporters of the ANC. Now that it's in power, its intentions are primarily focused on Cuba and Russia.
So, Jackie, we're actually going to talk about that because it's very important to try and understand the approach that South Africa has to foreign policy. And was it Churchill who said that countries have no permanent friends; they only have permanent interests. But I'm not sure that that actually applies to the way South African policymakers make foreign policy.
No, we only have historical friends.
Look, I suppose the one thing you have to say about the ANC, they are a loyal friend. You can murder, rape, and pillage. They don't care. If you were a friend before, you're a friend now, unless your name is Ukraine.
True. That even rhymes. That's really
But I think there's something to be said about that loyalty and friendship regardless.
No, it is. I mean, it is quite amazing, but it feeds into a deep felt anti-Western orientation, and a sense, and also a degree, I think, of, and this is a dangerous word to use, but a degree of racism, I think. But certainly the ANC feels that the West was not its partner, despite what I've just said about Sweden and many other countries like the Netherlands, and that they rail against the West. And that's very deeply held within the ANC, unfortunately. And it does South Africa a lot of harm, given our dominant trade relationships and so on.
So Danny Kadar, who's on controls this evening, and he's going to be monitoring the chat on YouTube and on Facebook, where we're broadcasting as well. And Danny, you actually went for your vitality check today, and you wanted to tell us a story.
Yes, I went for a vitality check today, and it's been confirmed that the ANC is actually a health hazard in my life. The nurse was taking my blood pressure, and I was busy talking about the ANC and everything that's going on. It's load shedding in politics. She took my blood pressure, she wrote down the results, and she says, "I'm going to retake your blood pressure, but can you not talk about politics while I do it?" And she took my blood pressure, and my blood pressure the second time came down. So it's a scientific proven fact that the ANC actually increases my blood pressure and is a health hazard in my life. So yeah, that was tested today.
So, Danny, did they prescribe you a pull of one of the opposition parties?
They told me just maybe stay away from Twitter and politics, just until we get your blood pressure down a little bit. So yeah, that's the doctor's orders.
Cool. So while we're waiting for our other guests to join us, and Tom is busy updating his Zoom, so he'll be on at the moment, and we hope Krista will join us in a moment as well. Hirsch, we're starting a film festival on Sunday, the first Jewish online film festival in the history of South Africa. And our first guest on Sunday is going to be Nancy Spielberg, Steven Spielberg's sister, award-winning international documentary maker. She's coming on to talk about making movies, and she's going to be talking about what constitutes a good storytelling. And the first one we're showing, Jakkie, I don't know if you know, but when Israel was formed in 1948, there was an arms embargo, particularly from the British, that wouldn't allow any weapons to go to Israel. And the Israeli Air Force was formed by ex-RAF soldiers and pilots, South Africans, many of them South Africans, Judge Cecil Margot, Dov Judah, Smokey Simon, and they were all part of the founding of the Israeli Defense Force. And they used to go into Europe and steal aeroplanes. It was the only weaponry they could get. And in fact, Nancy will tell us the story on Sunday night that the Royal Air Force, Tom, I don't know if you know the story, seeing you are British, the Royal Air Force refused to supply planes, so they set up a fake movie set. And they asked the Royal Air Force if they could borrow aeroplanes. And the pilots all came, got in, the cameras came, they filmed everything, the pilots took off, and they just continued flying. And that was how the Israeli Air Force got its original aircraft. And we're going to be telling that story on Sunday night with Nancy Spielberg.
It's the most remarkable documentary. I've seen it before. It's that story with the British airplanes is one of a few stories of how they were able to smuggle arms and airplanes and into Israel. It's an absolute must-watch show and webinar attend. It's fantastic.
And the personalities of these fighter pilots were just phenomenal. I mean, they were just real dog fighters, unbelievable personalities. I agree with Herschel. I watched it as well. It's an unbelievable documentary.
So, Herschel, thank you for joining us. We'll see you a little later. Danny, you're on controls this evening. Enormously grateful for that. And just a big welcome to everyone watching us tonight. We're broadcasting this evening on Zoom, on YouTube, and on Facebook. And we have people watching us from throughout the world. A big welcome to our guest this evening from Sweden, Jakkie Cilliers. Jakkie, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm just temporary here for the summer, but I stay in Pretoria.
Tom Eisenstadt, you're joining us from somewhere in the UK.
From Surrey, just south
from
of
Surrey in Sunday. Can we make you just slightly louder?
Yes. Is that better?
That's a little better, but as loud as possible. And Tom, you need to disclose to us your interest. You have South African parentage.
My grandfather was from Brits.
Okay, we won't hold that against you.
I usually keep it on the down low, but yes, you've caught me.
And it's always fantastic. You were in South Africa earlier. Earlier this year. You were in fact doing a game rangers course,
a tracking course.
Course
in Pafuri. The old tri-border.
Okay, good. Well, it's fantastic to have you on. We've been talking about having you on for the last year. And Professor Krista Johnson, a big welcome to you from, I presume, Washington, D.C.
Yes, indeed. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. It wasn't easy to track down a South African, a expert on South African-US relations. And we called the American Embassy and said, who knows more than anyone else? And you were the name.
Great.
And in fact, you're a professor at Howard University, not named after me.
No, that's correct. It was named after General Howard many moons ago.
So as someone who worked in Washington, D.C., I used to pop by Howard University primarily because I liked the clothing to have my name on.
Great.
So a big welcome to everyone. Just before we begin, just a reminder that this is in fact the 152nd webinar brought to you by the South African Jewish Report. We began this at the beginning of COVID. We wanted to provide a service to all the people of South Africa to help people with entertainment, with information, and with education during the COVID period. And we thought this would die at the end of the COVID, and it didn't. And we've managed to maintain an unbelievable audience, not just in South Africa, but around the world. So a huge welcome to everyone watching around the world. We've got big audiences tonight watching in the United States and Canada, Australia, in the UK, in Israel. And I think people are absolutely fascinated by tonight's discussion and tonight's topic, but also very interested and concerned about what's happening in South Africa and the impact of the break in US-South Africa relations for everyone personally as well. If you haven't gone and collected your copy of the South African Jewish Report this week, I strongly urge you to do that. For those of you out of the country, you may not know, but in Hammanskraal, there's been a big outbreak of cholera, and that's obviously enormously concerning. It's the breakdown of infrastructure as well, which has happened because of maladministration and because of corruption. And once again, the people of South Africa are suffering. Danny, I'm sure that block will move off your screen in a second. But on the front page of the Jewish Report this week is the story of cholera in Hammanskraal and the fear that at the Vaal as well, that there's going to be a cholera outbreak as well. So go collect your copy of the Jewish Report, please. As we mentioned to you, you can get it generally at your school, your butchery, your spaza shop, your garage shop, you're at Pick and Pay, at Exclusive Books. You'll find it all over the place. Danny, I don't know what's gone wrong with your screen, but I'm just seeing a big black blob on the screen. So if you can maybe stop and start that again, we'll do that. So if you haven't picked up your copy of the Jewish Report newspaper this week, please go and look online. You can go to www.sajr.co.za and you can either download the full edition on that website, or alternatively to that, you can go and look at the individual articles there as well. Danny, there we go. Let's flip through to the next one and see how we go. So as we said, sajr.co.za. And also just to announce, while Danny sorts out this little block across his screen, we are also, all our webinars are available. They're available on YouTube. They're also available on the Jewish Report's website. You can just go onto SAJR, click on webinars, and all 153 or 152 webinars that we've done are all there. And we announced this evening that we are beginning on Sunday night with the first ever online Jewish film festival. We've lined up a whole lot of remarkable movies for you to watch. The first one we're doing is Nancy Spielberg's Above and Beyond. Nancy Spielberg, sister to Stephen, is in fact joining us on Sunday evening. She's going to be talking about making movies and specifically about making documentaries. And we're going to be showing her unbelievable documentary, Above and Beyond. We're enormously excited about that. And then there's a South African version called 804. It's about the Machal, the 804 South Africans who went to go fight in Israel's War of Independence. We're showing that the next Sunday evening. And we've got unbelievable movies coming in from India, from South Africa, and around the world. You don't want to miss any of these. We're going to be sending out the links to register tomorrow, but at the same time, Danny will post the links for everyone who's watching onto the chat on Facebook, on Zoom, and on YouTube. So if you want to register quickly while we're talking, you can absolutely do that as well. So with that, big welcome to everyone this evening. And Tom, I want to start with you. As always, we have a very casual discussion and the audience participates as well. You can see people are posting in the chat and people are posting in the Q&A, and it's all of us talking to our audience out there. But Tom, Ukraine, it's fallen off a lot of our radars. What's happening? Is the war still going on in Ukraine? And we kept on hearing about the spring offensive, then the summer offensive. What is happening in the war in Ukraine at the moment?
I mean, I don't know if you've all seen, but in the last 2 days, we've had arguably the most embarrassing thing to ever happen to the Russian defense establishment with mass drone attacks on Moscow. Arguably, according to some OSINT experts, using Ukrainian drones. If you listen to Wagner's chief Prigozhin, it could have been an inside job. But in general, the summer offensive, as it now will be, appears to be going ahead. There's extensive shaping operations from the Ukrainians. There's an uptick in activity on every sector of the front. The Russians' own much vaunted winter offensive burnt out more or less in April, having primarily concentrated on Bakhmut and the Donbass axis. And now we're seeing a situation where even if Ukraine had to commit more resources than it would like to have done with the defense of Bakhmut, there are new armored brigades that have been formed with Western equipment that have been trained over the winter and into the spring. And even just from the Russians' own defense community's reactions, there is a clear expectation of a large number of offensive movements in the coming month or two. And of course, the Ukrainians don't really want anyone to know exactly where the hammer will fall, but it's already underway. And this is why we're seeing actually this month, this uptick in offensive activity from the Ukrainian side.
I have two short questions before we move off Ukraine. The one is, who's actually running the war on Russia's side? Because we see the Wagner Group. Who are the Wagner Group? And is it the Wagner Group running this war, or is it Moscow? That's number one. And the second question is, how is it going for both sides?
So for the first question, the idea that the Wagner Group is in fact significantly independent from the Russian defense establishment is a deliberate myth put out by the Russians themselves. When it was founded, it was clearly done with a lot of FSB officials, and in many ways it acts as a sort of deniable overseas asset of the Russian military. Wagner, however, was given as almost, if you like, a subcontracted responsibility for the Bakhmut offensive, and until late in the autumn, exclusive rights to recruit Russian prisoners. But in fact, the Russian Defense Ministry is theoretically overseeing everything, and everything is integrated within the Russians' regional command system. However, due to the nature of separatist forces, various militias there's a very opaque picture often on the operational level who exactly is calling the shots. It often seems that certain units or militia, or indeed rebel groups from the Ukrainian perspective, but also mercenary groups, are assigned sectors of the front and given general orders. In terms of how the war is going, considering that the initial expectation, we believe, from all indicators from the Russian side, was a quick victory in 3 days, I think we can safely say that the Ukrainians are having a better time of it. Russia has arguably lost over half of its main battle tanks that it can realistically deploy. It's had upwards of 200,000 casualties. Its international reputation, which we'll obviously be exploring tonight, is massively damaged. It's more reliant on China than ever. It's suffering a massive brain drain from emigration. Ukraine has suffered and has, again, very high casualty figures, but it's managed to rally a huge international support network, primarily built around NATO in the United States. It's seeing newer and more capable weapons being delivered, and its military is arguably adapted far better and more effectively to the challenges of a huge conventional war than the Russians have.
So let's actually deal first of all with the relationship that South Africa has traditionally had with both Ukraine and with Russia. Jakkie, there's a long history. It goes back to the era of apartheid. Tell us about the USSR and South Africa, and then tell us about the relations between South Africa with the components of the USSR, one of which is Russia and one of which is Ukraine.
Yes, it's a long history that goes back to the Anglo-Boer War, in actual fact, and of course to the South African Communist Party and its very close relationships, particularly with the establishment of the Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, but also within the ANC itself. So, of course, the main factor driving all of this was that after the end of the Second World War, the competition between the Soviet Union and the West intensified 1 year after the other, and eventually a number of then during the so-called Cold War, a number of proxy wars were fought, amongst them in Africa, as the Cold War and the competition between the West and the former Soviet Union ensured stability in Europe, except maybe in places like Czechoslovakia, but pushed instability out into Africa. And of course, part of the competition that happened in Africa was a competition between the Soviet Union, China, and others on the one side, and the so-called West. And during this period, from the independence period in the 1960s, during the so-called independence struggles, of course, the former Soviet Union and to an extent China supported various liberation parties in their fight, and the various governments were largely supported by the West. And you can look at the former Zaire or the DR Congo, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and so on and so forth in our part of the world. And these historical relationships included in the case of the ANC and Umkhonto we Sizwe, the provision of training, not only in what is now known as Russia, but also in Ukraine. But as I was saying in our before when we were chatting, the ANC also received significant support from a country like Sweden, where I am now. In actual fact, the most non-military support that the ANC got was from Sweden. But when push came to shove, the final, let's call it, wars of the Cold War were fought in Angola and in Ethiopia. In both those instances, actually largely sometimes with the advice, sometimes against Soviet Union advice, Cuba played a huge role. Cuba provided troops and equipment that effectively outfoxed for example, the SADF in Angola. You may remember that during the 70s and 80s, South Africa steadily occupied southern parts of Angola to provide a kind, let's call it a deep defense against the infiltration of SWAPO into what is Southwest Africa, now Namibia. And then what happened is that eventually Cuba came to the support of the MPLA, flew in thousands of soldiers and equipment that advanced downwards to places like Quito, Carnaval, and so on. The SADF mobilized, but that was at the time of the negotiations around the future of then Southwest Africa. And eventually, I think it was Resolution 435, through which South Africa then provided independence to basically its former colony of Southwest Africa. So that assistance, that role that Cuba has played and that Russia played, both in the provision of training to the ANC in Umkhonto we Sizwe, although it was very small, but particularly in Angola, and the role that Cuba played was quite decisive and tipped the scales in favor of, in this instance, SWAPO and the MPLA in Namibia, which then eventually won the elections. So that history, both of the former Soviet Union and of Cuba, have remained ingrained in the thinking and the DNA of the ANC, which was a relatively small party, that rode on the effect of the Soweto riots of 1976, which was basically instigated more by the Black Consciousness movement than by the ANC. But the ANC, through that and the flame of Mandela and his image globally, meant that when the ANC was unbanned, it managed, in a sense, to take over the broad social movement that was run by the United Democratic Front in the social movement that led to the historical settlement in South Africa. And really, the ANC has proven itself largely incapable of running quite a sophisticated country in economic terms, and had to embark on a number of alliances and partnerships, initially with COSATU, but also with the various homeland administrations, which really have imbued the organization with many of the features of corruption and incompetence that we see so blatantly evident today. So that's sort of a short history of what happened, and in a sense, why we find ourselves in such a difficult position today.
But Jakkie, correct to say that there are hundreds of ANC cadres and military who are trained in both Ukraine and Russia, both
yes.
of being
yes,
part of the former Soviet Union.
But the amount of assistance was relatively small. I think at the time that the peace agreement started, really about 9,000, 12,000, of course, many more informal cadres in the townships then eventually were joined or were nominally part of the movement, but not in a formal sense of the word.
So, Krista, is it fair to say that the United States was maybe a little late to the party? That in fact, because it was a proxy war between the former Soviet Union and the United States, that in fact, the United States sided with the apartheid government along the way. And certainly during the period of Ronald Reagan, I think one could safely say that the apartheid regime was propped up by the United States. Is that a fair comment?
I think it is. I mean, not late to the party. We backed the wrong horse, right? Or we backed the losing horse, if you will. And so, yeah, and I think that, I mean, you all know better than I do. South Africa has a long memory, and that is certainly, you know, kind of that history certainly plays into and continues to play into U.S.-South Africa relations today. I think, you know, it's a little bit more complicated than that, though, of course, because we had a very vibrant anti-apartheid movement here in the United States. So I think South Africans are able to, you know, be sophisticated and discern kind of the difference between support by the U.S. government and then the support for the liberation struggle by a large portion of the American public. And that certainly, you know, kind of culminated in the 1980s before the demise of apartheid.
So since South Africa achieved its liberation 29 years ago, how have those relations been over the last 28 years, should we say? We'll deal with the last year separately, but have relations been good? Has South Africa been given opportunity? Has America made amends for maybe backing the wrong horse?
The relations have been good, right? So, and I think even today, you know, the idea that, oh, all of a sudden things are going to implode in the next couple of weeks, I think is probably not realistic. South Africa and the United States, I think, have always historically had this kind of interesting relationship, in part because of the history that, as we were mentioning, right, that the U.S. government supported the apartheid regime. And so what that has meant is that certainly, I mean, South Africa is probably in some ways one of the U.S.'s most contentious or kind of difficult partners to you know, engage with on the African continent, because also given the ANC's history as a liberation movement, et cetera, they have been very, very vocal and very, very forthcoming in advocating for sovereignty and autonomy when it comes to international relations and their own foreign policy. So this is, I mean, the kind of current events really explicitly also, you know, kind of speak to that, where the South African government has in many instances has certainly not aligned itself with the United States in terms of international relations issues, and has, kind of condemned the U.S. invasion of Iraq and other things, but then of course has not condemned Russia's invasion here, and we can talk, I guess, a little bit more about why that is. But the relations really are actually rather strong. We have the South Africa is very much economically allied with the West and with the United States, and that's not going to change. I think that there's a kind of a perception, and maybe there's a kind of politically and maybe ideologically, I think South Africa likes to kind of embrace a South-South alliance, or kind of, partnership. But economically, there's, very strong ties there. And then I would also say, even militarily, right? There's been quite a bit of military cooperation between South Africa and the United States, training, joint training of troops, et cetera, et cetera. So there, the tension has tended to be oftentimes a bit at the rhetorical level over these larger international relations issues.
So let's just talk about US aid to South Africa, because our entire HIV/AIDS program is funded by the Americans, is it not?
No, it's not.
Okay. It's about 10 billion rand a year, though.
Howard, do not put me on record saying that. No, but we do have PEPFAR, which was a highly successful program for us for a number of reasons. It was, and for the world really, and certainly for African countries in South Africa, certainly. And yeah, I mean, and I think that certainly, kind of went a long way to kind of push back against, anti-Americanism, or, kind of anti-Americanism sentiment that South Africans, may have had. But in addition to that, I mean, I think what's more, kind of strategically of concern, of course, for South Africa is things like AGOA and our preferential trade, status that we give to South Africa.
Krista, explain AGOA to us.
Okay, so AGOA is the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act. And it's been around for a while now. It's due to be renewed again in 2025, but it's been around at least, I think, since 2014 or so. But in essence, it's a preferential trade agreement that we have with most African countries to say that they can import, it encourages them to import their goods to the United States and to, kind of encourage two-way trade. It's interesting. It's actually, even though, I mean, you can look at it in different ways. Some say that it hasn't been terribly successful, just because actually most of the United States preferential trade agreements with developing countries have not been terribly successful. So some of the, I guess, negative statistics are that it's about, I think 52% of the goods that are traded or that are brought into the United States is like oil, oil and, kind of products like that, as opposed to other manufactured products. But that's not the case with South Africa. South Africa actually imports cars, right? I mean, or that's a big thing that exports
cars to the US.
That's right. Sorry, that's right. They export cars from South Africa to the United States. And what's significant about that, so South Africa in some ways is an interesting and maybe a good model for where AGOA should consider going or look to go, because it's manufactured products that the United States imports from South Africa largely. And what that does is, it's not just that it's manufactured products and, kind of high end, products, but also it creates jobs in South Africa, right? So you have, as you all know, right, you have a large auto industry, right, in the Eastern Cape, which is a job creator, right, which is an important thing, of course, for South Africans and for the South African government. So there's about 400 billion rands worth of trade between the two countries each year. It's an enormous amount. In fact, I think only China is bigger, but United States, Europe account for about 70% of South African trade. But Tom, war breaks out February last year between Russia and Ukraine. Russia invades Ukraine. How does South Africa react?
Initially, there is sort of muted condemnation. But then, yes, rapidly it sort of evolves to a non-aligned, so-called non-aligned position. I mean, it's also worth bearing in mind, of course, in this context, that from a Ukrainian perspective, Ukraine was a founding member of the United Nations, and as part of the Soviet Union, always backed the ANC in an equal capacity with Russia. So I think there was perhaps a greater expectation of condemnation from African countries of a unilateral invasion. And then we increasingly see towards the end of last year and into this year, more sort of normalization and positive engagement between the South Africans and the Russians, and evidence of increasing US irritation at this, leading up to the momentous incident itself in December.
So I want to ask Jakkie, because obviously South Africa is a sovereign state. It doesn't have to be neutral. It can support Russia. It just has to face the consequences. So one of the issues that we have is we claim neutrality, but are we actually neutral in this conflict?
And not really. I mean, South Africa is a member of BRICS. We were invited to the BRICS partnership by Putin, and that elevated South Africa. Remember that happened at the Jacob Zuma came into power just after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. South Africa was not growing. He looked around, and in a sense, the invitation to join the BRICS came at a time when everybody was speaking about the rise of Asia and the West was stuck. And then there was also the promise of the nuclear deal, apparently from Putin to Zuma. And a membership of BRICS elevated South Africa into a global club, seen very often as sort of the alternative to the G7, where we really have the potential to look towards the future growth, because future growth is going to come from Asia. But the reality is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the deliberate targeting of civilians, the threat of nuclear weapons, the clear violation of the territorial sovereignty, in a sense, is beyond the pale. And what South Africa's position has been, we've been played by the Russians, and we have not taken a neutral stance. You know, if a duck walks like a duck and acts like a duck, it must be a duck. And South Africa claims to be non-aligned, but in actual fact, we have been, we've been basically supporting Russia, and that has not been good for our trade relations, because as Krista Johnson has indicated, the majority of the South African economy is tied to the West. It may be shifting trade, and it's also much higher value, and that's where our investment comes from. So I think a non-aligned position does not necessarily mean that you simply agree with Russia. It can mean that you take a position of principle on what is a clear violation of international law. And South Africa has chosen not to do that and played footsie with Russia. And the reality is that the American ambassador, I think, overreacted, went out on a bit of a limb, but it's cost South Africa dearly. And I think both sides, you can see that the US and South Africa, in a sense, are trying to downplay this and not create a crisis, because South Africa is an important partner. But both the Europeans and the Americans are upset with the South Africans.
Jakkie, I want to interject there, because one of the viewers keeps on saying that South Africa is non-neutral, it's non-aligned. But non-aligned means you're not connected to either side. South Africa is aligned. It's just aligned to the Russian side. That's not non-alignment. It went out of its way to actively go and humiliate the Ukrainian ambassador to South Africa. She couldn't get an appointment with Durko, while at the same time, all of our officials were running to Moscow. South Africa took an active stance on the one side. It was, and you may say, non-aligned to the West, but it was definitely aligned to something else.
Yeah, no, I think that's obvious in our actions. I should say the Ukrainian ambassador is probably not the only one struggling to get an appointment with Durko. Our experience is everybody struggles to get an appointment with anybody in Durko.
So, Tom, I wanted to turn now to this boat, the Lady R, a roll-on, roll-off cargo vessel. Its home port is, in fact, just next door on the Black Sea, just next to Crimea. And in October last year, it starts this little bizarre voyage down the coast. Tell us a little about the Lady R's journey.
Well, it made various interesting, you could say, Wagner-linked African stops before it eventually ends up in Simonstown. But fundamentally, there is this ambiguity if it was actually picking things up or dropping them off on its journey down. I forget the exact order of African states it hit, but again, it's aligning with Russia's deployments in the western coast of Africa. And then, yes, once it's arrived in Simonstown, it then continued on, interestingly, to Mozambique and Sudan, which I think is perhaps the critical component of its journey.
Well, let us actually just stop, because it goes through the Mediterranean, it comes down the west coast of Africa, it meanders down, it stops a few places along the way, and in fact goes past Cape Town and goes past Simonstown. In fact, it goes as far as Cape Agulhas, and mysteriously it turns off its tracking beacons at Cape Agulhas, does a U-turn, comes back with its tracking beacons turned off into the Simonstown harbor, reportedly says it's having engine problems, but people see that under cover of darkness, 2 tugs, in fact, bring it into Simonstown. While in Simonstown, apparently the traditional naval personnel who are on the base are removed. And according to the Americans, cargo trucks arrive, 4 or 6 big containers get loaded onto the onto the boat in the Simonstown base at midnight. The boat then departs Simonstown, goes towards Mozambique, and mysteriously turns on its tracking beacons again. That would appear slightly suspicious, at least to me.
But I think the interesting thing, of course, is a lot of these, there are 2 factors here, which is basically, one is that Russia is trying currently to be subtle when it delivers weapon systems, where it drops them off, where it picks them up. So a lot of this, again, is to add an element of deniability, because it is embarrassing. And obviously, you assume the South African government would like to keep its relations good with the United States. On the army conducting the offloading operation, if it is in fact true, as I believe the South African Defence Minister said, that this was an offloading of a overdue ammunition order for the South African Special Forces, it makes sense, under my understanding of South African military rules, for the army to actually be involved in the escorting and the protection of any of those cargoes when offloaded. There have been instances of ammunition being stolen from South African ports in the past, 2021, 2016. So that is arguably consistent with the official explanation we've been given. The interesting question then is, what was put back onto the ship, if at all, which is something I could talk for hours about. But fundamentally, that is the crux. And the issue here is that this is the allegation made by the US that munitions, and I believe an unnamed source supposedly leaked, rocket propellant were loaded onto the ship. But this begs many questions about what weapon systems or munitions that South Africa has could ever be realistically integrated with the Russian forces, or are useful to, and this perhaps is more likely, Russian proxies, whether then the ship offloaded what was unloaded in either Mozambique or in fact in Sudan. There was the interesting follow-up to this, obviously, with the Aleutian 76 landing at Waterkloof Air Base.
That's the big aeroplane that mysteriously lands, that when South Africa's asked what another sanctioned Russian craft is doing in South Africa, they say delivering diplomatic mail.
Yeah, and one arguably that's also is sanctioned because it's been specifically, that airline has been used by the Wagner Group at length, and it's the basis for the sanctioning of it by the US. So there were rumors that those planes were doing far more journeys than the one time reported. So yes, there's a huge amount hinges on what was offloaded, and more importantly, probably what was put onto the ship. But officially only classified US intelligence report, and you'd hope the South African Defence Ministry is aware of that information. Again, there's an interesting dimension here, which I think also makes the idea that South Africa is being non-aligned more complicated, which is, to what degree does the South African government know what South African defence companies are, of course, doing? If you look at Denel's exports last year, huge amounts of artillery shell, 40mm grenade contracts with European countries. The implication there is that a lot of that was then used by the joint, what is now in fact the joint Ukraine, NATO, EU ammunition system to actually supply Ukrainian forces. So does the right hand know what the left is doing? That's the other sort of key question here, to understand or even to begin to speculate what has occurred.
So Krista, before we come to you to talk about this flurry of diplomatic activity that happens with Antony Blinken coming to South Africa and Janet Yellen coming to South Africa, before I pose that question to you, Jakkie, I want to ask, what does South Africa have or manufacture that could be of any use to Russia in its conflict, or the Wagner Group?
I think far too much is being made about the potential provision of arms to South Africa. I tend to believe the Minister of Defense. Old order, I'm not sure what was loaded. We don't know. Maybe the Commission of Inquiry will get to that. But I don't believe South Africa provided anything. And, you know, if you have stayed next to neighbors that interpret what is happening on your property, you would know that what actually happened and what the neighbors think happened is often quite at odds. So I don't take this arms provision seriously, and I don't think South Africa's got much to offer Russia. Even if there was some South African company smuggled something onto the ship, which is not impossible, it won't be consequential.
And would you say, if there was weapons put on, was it meant for the Ukraine conflict, or was it meant for the Wagner Group somewhere in Africa? I imagine, Tom, you probably have an idea of that.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, arguably, in terms of what would be valuable, and of course this is pure speculation, but the fact is that South African defense companies are leading in artillery technology. And this goes back to apartheid and the development of the G5, the G6 system. Unlikely, because of course, I think now you have Rheinmetall owns a 51% stake in Denel's munitions company. However, if there was even something as simple as base bleed technology, prototype guidance shells, any sort of drone thing, there are many things that would be of use to Russian research and development, particularly given the issues they have with artillery accuracy, with navigation systems, chip shortages for guided missiles. And South Africa, of course, has a decent capability in guided missiles. You also think about the fact that their drone technology is so behind even South Africa's relatively modest accomplishments in military drones. Any of that technology could arguably be useful and would be used in the format, not rather as weapons to be used in Ukraine, but for a research and development type role. Wagner Group, it's harder to see again, because the issue is, and I'm sure as many of you are aware, there is almost no compatibility between any South African military or Soviet design system. All the calibers are different. There are almost no munitions that are interchangeable, and South Africa basically only controls or has a small number of Soviet small arms.
But so that also holds for the artillery expertise. South African artillery is NATO standard. It's 155 and so on and so forth. So there is nothing that South Africa could or would have provided that would make any difference, I think, to Russia's war on Ukraine. I just don't think that that's feasible. Our defense industry has largely been destroyed. And the technology lead that South Africa had on artillery 10 years ago is no longer really of international significance. So, I'm just sort of thinking, if it was artillery systems, you would need a bulk on onload. So, yeah, I'm not sure that anything was unloaded on that ship, and I think we have to wait until the Commission of Inquiry comes out to prove that anything was loaded there.
So, Krista, let's talk about, we clearly, for want of a better description, pissed off the Americans. And we saw Anthony Blinken coming to South Africa, and we saw Janet Yellen come to South Africa. And in fact, our Minister of Finance tells us that Janet Yellen raised the issue of the lady armed these weapons in their discussions. What's been happening behind the scenes that we don't know before the American ambassador released his public statement?
Yes, well, let me also say that, I mean, I think I'll agree with Jackie and Tom. We obviously, we're all speculating now, and there's a lot of information that we don't know. And I think probably nobody, and I don't anticipate any of the parties are going to act or, come out and do anything, rash until the inquiry is, completed and we have more information. So we're all kind of, going on speculation here. Just to kind of start off with your initial, kind of point of all of these high-level U.S. officials coming to South Africa. And in addition, I would argue, or I would remind people, Ramaphosa was actually also invited to Washington and came and met with President Biden in September of last year, right? So that was also significant, and really, I think, signaled the U.S.'s, intention and, kind of desire to continue to, maintain its strategic and key partnership with South Africa as one of our key partners, on the African continent. So that was all, I think shows the kind of importance that both parties put on that relationship. So then, then the question, though, as Jackie was saying, then becomes, well, then, if this is such an important, strategic relationship, sorry, my cat's in the way. If it's such an important strategic relationship, then why would Ambassador Brigety come out and do this, especially if it is only, if we're not sure actually that it was arms that was put, or if anything was put onto the ship. And it's interesting, you all will recall, right? Ambassador Brigety's words were very clear. He said something like to the effect of, "I'd bet my life on it," or something.
I would
right?
stake my life on the accuracy of that assertion.
Right. So, that sounds very, very, confident to me. And then, my second thought would be, a U.S. ambassador isn't going to go out there and say that kind of make that kind of definitive statement unless that's been, approved by Washington, and there are higher ups who know what that statement. But what's also now then remarkable to me is, in some ways, Ambassador Brigety is being thrown under the bus. There was a piece in Politico today which was quoting Biden administration officials who said that the Biden administration was uncomfortable with Brigety's actions and the nature of his assertions. So, it's not just that they're kind of walking it about. So now at this stage, I don't feel comfortable at all, saying that something happened or that something didn't happen. But it does go to the issue, as you said, of U.S.-South Africa relations, because if we weren't, sure, 100% or certainly 80% sure of what was going on there, why did the Biden administration risk its relationship with South Africa? Of course, South Africa has a lot more to lose, right? The U.S. doesn't have that much to lose, except for, I guess, this kind of, credibility. But South Africa has a lot more to lose. The U.S. has clearly put the South African government and President Ramaphosa in this, kind of awkward position. If we were looking to kind of, isolate Russia and kind of, get the South African government and South Africans more aligned with Russia, if this all implodes in our face, it will have the complete opposite effect, right? Of saying, here's the U.S. again, meddling and trying to, kind of stir the pot and make up stories, to get us to support, the side that they want us to support. The other thing is, as you all know, right, we've had, South Africa has had, this announcement has had economic reverberations, right, in the South African economy. And certainly it's been the economic sector and the economic elites who have come out and have been most vocal against the South African government on this. And again, that's problematic for Ramaphosa because the economic elites are, of course, a critical base or a critical, ally of his in governing. So I'm not sure what what the end game is, right, for the U.S. To, in some ways, weaken Ramaphosa and certainly maybe, provide or create certain wedges between him and the economic elites that he will certainly need. But I think also, my colleagues at Howard had an interesting piece. This was actually a couple of months ago on U.S. South Africa policy. That really was urging the Biden administration to, be more proactive in terms of even before the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit that we had in December, in terms of sending trade delegations to South Africa. We have this the Obama administration created this program called Power Africa. We were supposed to, help create energy, right, and energy resources on the continent. Why isn't that working more effectively to help, South Africans address the energy crisis that is not only, continuing, but seems to be actually increasing? So it's kind of, I don't know, I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, and I don't want to speculate too much what the motivations of the Biden administration are, but it seems a little puzzling. And what you're hearing, or some of the things that you're hearing from Washington now, are walking back some of the assertions.
But can we presume that Ambassador Brigety didn't go rogue? That in fact he
I think we can, right? I think we surely can.
Yeah,
I think
he didn't. That he got instructions from Washington, from Foggy Bottom, to in fact say exactly what he did.
I don't think we know that. I don't think.
You don't think we know that?
Yeah, I think he overstepped. I think he overstepped the mark a little bit, and has had and people are trying to walk back that statement because it's created uncomfortability on both sides of the Atlantic, both in the US and in South Africa. And in a sense, we're trying to downplay that, but I think that is separate to the issue of South Africa's very clear alignment and support of Russia. Which I think irks him and irks many in the West.
Well, Tom, sorry, please.
Well, I was just going to say, arguably, you could read it as a shot across the bow, right? In the sense that America is very interested and has indicated going forward in the second half of this year that it's looking at least the idea of secondary sanctions on any state that enables Russia to circumvent sanctions, particularly things like microchips. To create or to use a legitimate excuse to create a diplomatic incident that alarms partners of America that are arguably, from the American perspective, acting out of line is in itself useful, because you saw how the markets reacted, the fear it's created about the state of US-South Africa relations. That itself has a purpose in warning states that are seen to collude with Russia that it's probably not worth their while.
Well, sorry. I was just also going to add. I think U.S. foreign policy is kind of being over-determined, or kind of the big elephant in the room is this war in Ukraine, and it's shaping all kinds of kind of U.S. foreign policy. I think had this had we not had the war in Ukraine. This would have been a blip, right? I mean, I don't think that this would have gotten the attention that's, that it has gotten. And so I think that's a problem. But I also think, to Tom's point as well, that you're in this interesting, and it goes to, I think, one of the audience members' comment too about non-aligned, are we neutral or non-aligned? We're in a very different, kind of international order, right? It's no longer unipolar, but we're not quite multipolar yet, right? And so, what does that mean to be non-aligned? It's not the old non-alignment of, the past, right? So certainly, and I think what you see is South Africa is clearly working through how do we structure our partnerships in this contemporary global order, right? And the United States, I think, is too. I think we're, unfortunately, we're still trying to trying to recreate the unipolar world, right? And that's going to be problematic as well. And I think we have to think actually, or the United States has to think, I think, differently about that. But so there's this interesting, I think, kind of navigation that's going on both parts, where international relations and these kind of global, these alliances, alliances and partnerships are how they're being structured is being kind of redefined and re-identified.
And I presume that in fact Russia is loving this. If it can drive an increasing wedge between South Africa and the United States, it's in Russia's interest to do so. And I think
playing South Africa.
We've seen, and Jackie, I'll come to you. I just want to give two examples. We gave, for example, Putin the opportunity to not come to South Africa for the BRICS summit, and we gave him the opportunity to do it on a digital platform. And he says, no, I want to come, putting South Africa in a very difficult position. That was number one. The South African head of the defense force goes to Moscow. Moscow announces it. And then South Africa's gone to say, no, he's just gone for talks with his colleagues. And Moscow says, no, he's gone for war preparedness talks. So the Russians seem to be stirring the pot in order to make sure that this is a very deep wedge and a break in relations. Is that a correct assessment, Jackie?
Yes, I think so. I think that South Africa has been quite clumsy in how it's dealt with us. And the Russians have played us. And they are very adept at this. And we've unfortunately seem to feel a deep indebtedness to Russia, and we've simply, not prepared to, despite the fact that we're a member of BRICS, and that's very important for South Africa and for our foreign policy. The violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, the attack on civilians, the threat of nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. Russia has contravened the basic tenets of the global rules-based system to the extent that that still holds. So, and South Africa just, remains and says, no, we should, we call for an end to the war. The fighting must stop. Yes, the fighting can stop when Russia withdraws from Ukraine. But I mean, it's just we're making fools of ourselves in one sense. And I think demonstrating an ineptness, which is quite difficult to explain, and it is doing damage to South Africa. Our foreign policy should serve to reinforce the tenets that are contained in our constitution, but they should serve South Africa's interests. And it is not in South Africa's interests to go up against our major trading partners. We need to be a little bit more nuanced. And I think it's that lack of nuance that just exposes South Africa, it exposes the Rand, it exposes everything, our economy at a time when we really are struggling. So I think there are many, many challenges lessons that can be learned on how to not deal with a challenge, which we seem to have failed on every occasion in this instance.
Krista, there's one ingredient that we have to throw into the pot, and that is, given ANC efficiency while the policy and elective conference took place in December, the final document, particularly relating to international affairs, was released in April. And that document very clearly blames the United States for provoking a war or provoking the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I believe the Americans didn't take very well to that approach either.
No, not at all. So I think, I don't know. I feel like South Africa absolutely, I think, could have handled this better and was very clumsy in terms of, kind of its engagement and how it's practicing non-alignment, if you will, at the moment has been very, very clumsy, to say the least. I think, again, though, I think that, for the West, I think it's important to vote. Well, the South Africa is always going to probably point out the United States foreign policy hypocrisies, which we have, many. So, we talk human rights and democracy, and then, sometimes we do other things or back other people. So that's fine. But I think that, strategically, what would be useful to do is to ensure that the ANC government, that the South African government succeeds, to provide the resources. I mean, that was what our U.S. Africa Leaders Summit was about. It was, how do we, kind of get more trade and investment and, engagement and, on with the continent. So I think that they have to kind of, put their money where their mouth is and do that. But I would also say, I think it was maybe Jakkie who was talking about BRICS and that. I mean, I think that was also an impetus, because one of my questions was why was Ambassador Brigety making this statement now when in fact this happened in December? And I think it probably does have a lot to do with, I think the US is more, concerned with, or maybe than they're saying, with the announcement that South Africa was good, or that to put on the BRICS agenda a new currency, or a different kind of foreign currency, trade currency for the BRICS countries. I think that might have been behind some of the provoking of this recent crisis or statements.
Jakkie?
Howard, can I just add something? There's lots of talk about the end of the dollar. Now, in my day job, I do long-term forecasting, and the demise of the dollar is several decades away. There's lots of talk about this, but I don't think so. On that issue, I don't think that that's really a deal breaker. I think that, I don't think that we've moved into a multipolar world, a much more crowded, flat world. The South is gaining in power and power is shifting towards Asia and so on and so forth. But the West will continue to dominate. And although our forecast would indicate, Russia becomes, the Chinese economy overtakes the US economy in about a decade, and in about 2 decades, China is the most powerful country in the world. Russia is not a global actor. In actual fact, Russia, through what is happening, Russia will pay the ultimate price. It will become a lackey of China. The
just to put into perspective, Jakkie, the Russian economy is actually the same size of Spain, or at least before the war was the same size of Spain, and it's probably smaller at the moment.
Spain with nuclear weapons. That was always the joke. It's about the same size as Brazil.
And we used to think that in fact Russia was a military superpower, but now we realize it's actually it's a very poor power with nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Although with purchasing power parity, its real-time spending was always a lot higher than we realized. So, I mean, to do with what the ANC thinks it's doing, of course, here, though, it refers back to a 1970s German diplomatic history debate. But arguably, if we look at this through the lens of what the Germans at the time called the Primat der Innenpolitik, the primacy of domestic politics, arguably what the ANC has been doing is for a domestic audience. And a lot of its foreign policy is, in fact, driven by the internal demands of the party and competing demands with, particularly now arguably the EFF, who obviously were quite happy with what happened supposedly at Simonstown. So again, the rationality of it has to be looked at through 2 lenses. Yes, South Africa and its place in the world, but also from a domestic perspective, how does South Africa form its foreign policy? Is it in fact driven by ANC power dynamics and the electorate? In terms of BRICS, yes, I mean, there are other states in the global South that have taken an interesting position where they are as close to China as ever before. Pakistan, yet happy to provide weapons to Ukraine, because as Jakkie says, Russia in the grand scheme of things is becoming ever more of an irrelevance, just one with nuclear weapons. So South Africa here has taken obviously quite a deliberate strategy, it could be argued, but one that differs perhaps from the standard Außenpolitik view of how you should conduct international relations.
Well, Krista, we know that circulating in the US Congress at the moment are 2 bills, a Republican bill and a Democratic bill. Tell us about these bills and what does it mean for us in South Africa?
Well, I don't know much about the bills, and I don't think, again, you're going to see anything emerge in the next, before we have the inquiry or the, we know we have all the facts. There's, I think, too much missing information at the moment. But to Tom's point, it's interesting because this has become a little bit of a domestic political issue here as well. So that you have Senator Rich, who is the ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, has been very vocal against coming out against the Biden administration. He's making the argument that the Biden administration has thrown our ambassador Brigety under the bus, and that we should have, supported him and backed him, et cetera, et cetera. But so it's interesting, but because my sense is that the Republicans see an opportunity to use this as kind of a signal that to be able to say that the Biden administration has been poor on foreign policy, which is a little bit ironic, of course, because President Biden is supposed to be, very, very astute when it comes to foreign policy. That's kind of why, he went in. And so it's kind of ironic that, because of course we are already ramping up our presidential elections campaign. So people are already beginning to campaign, and certainly campaign against President Biden, who has already said that he's going to run. So, I don't think you're going to see anything in the near term. And I don't think that there's a chance that the Republican bill would pass. I think what might be somewhat, being discussed would be, which I think would be a mistake, would be to remove, say, South Africa's preferential trade status, like remove them from AGOA. That would be a mistake. I think cooler minds and heads will prevail both in South Africa and in the United States, and that probably won't even see the light of day. I haven't heard anything. I think it's very far-fetched to assume that South Africa or the United States would impose any kinds of sanctions or anything.
Because Bloomberg ran that story 2 days ago. Bloomberg ran that story 2 days ago, that the United States was considering sanctions on South Africa.
I don't think so.
That's not a possibility, certainly not in the near term. Our major risk is AGOA that you explained to us, the duty-free access into the United States, and we probably still have a while to go. There's no emergency that we should pack our bags in South Africa today and head to our shores.
No.
I think the other big issue, of course, is what happens with the US presidential elections. If somebody like Trump comes in, all bets are off. That's what the Russians are waiting for. It could upend AGOA and everything else. The so-called Western alliance that is in support of Ukraine could fold. That's what Russia is banking on. Yeah. So I think that's a bigger, challenge that I think that will affect global relations going forward.
But one of the things that happened to us after Ambassador Brigaty's announcement was our currency collapsed again. Just when you think it can't get worse, it gets much worse. And we're currently trading at what, 1987 to the dollar. Just as a comparison, when Ramaphosa took office 5 years ago, we were sitting at 12 Rand to the dollar. And when the ANC took over 29 years ago, we were at 3 Rand to the dollar.
Wow.
So, that's telling us a story, and it's telling us a story about what the international community thinks we're worth as a country. Yes, so what do we do about that? Oh, sorry, Tom.
Well, it's also the threat, isn't it? And South Africa might never see sanctions imposed because all the US has to do is raise the prospect of them on the horizon, and it instantly has an effect on the economy. Mm-hmm. So this is, in fact, the kind of hand-slapping power the US arguably has over major trade partners. It never has to follow it through. It just has to merely raise the prospect.
And we're doing all the damage ourselves. Let's face it. The way in which we mismanage our economy, nobody needs to help us in doing that. It is just absolutely amazing. Where you speak about electricity or infrastructure or trade policy, we don't need to then also pick a fight with the US. It's just like stupid.
But Jakkie, we have a major advantage as a nation. We don't have hurricanes, we don't have earthquakes, we don't have famine. All our problems are self-inflicted, yes. Which means that they're all capable of solution. We just need proper, credible leadership that understands the world and doesn't understand the world through the eyes of the Soviet Union 40, 50 years ago.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right, because the ANC does not look at evidence. It doesn't look at fact. It only looks at sort of past relationships and loyalties, which may have been good, and one can understand that. But as I said, speaking to you from Sweden, why does the ANC not consider the sort of allegiances that was built up, for example, from Sweden and the Netherlands and countries that also played a huge role in the anti-apartheid struggle, if they have such a big problem with the US and the UK and so on. And it just beggars belief how our economic policies can be so wrong-headed, and why our domestic policies are so reflected by just pure incompetence.
So, I see someone's just posted to say the ANC follows Chinese model, but the Chinese model is in fact a completely practical model of how to develop the Chinese economy, while our current government seems to do absolutely everything to destroy our economy. I mean, that's one of the great disasters that we have. So I wanted to talk in a few minutes about how we get out of the mess. But before we do that, there's the story circulating that one of the key reasons for the alliance between South Africa and Russia is that money arrives in Pretoria and our current political leadership goes to collect a salary check, and that the ANC's election campaign will be illegally funded next year by Russian donations. We already know that the largest two donors to the ANC are Russian oligarchs. So is there a fear that in fact, in return for the favors that we've been granting the Russians, that their reply is going to be quite simply $50 million US bars our next election? Jakkie, do you have a concern?
I am concerned about it. It's a sense of disappointment and dismay that I must say that a few years ago, I would not have given that thinking any credence. But if you look at what has happened and you look at the activities of a company like Chancellor House, which is the ANC's investment house, and the role they played, for example, in the construction of Cilliers and so on and so forth, then I would say nothing is off the table. I am concerned. I don't think there's a direct relationship, but certainly there are influences that are that are being exerted on the ANC. So I am concerned about that. And I say that with a deep sense of regret, because I don't think that the ANC that I knew of 5, 10, 20 years ago would have been, that they would have had an inkling of doing something like this. But the ANC of today is a very different animal.
Tom, you're an intelligence analyst. We hear reports of Russian meddling in American elections. Are we at risk in South Africa?
Yeah, I think I'd look closer to home at the number of African states in which there's very overt interference by either the Wagner Group or subsidiaries of it, and then Russian political assistance or interference, depending on how you look at it, to ruling parties. I mean, Madagascar is a recent example. Yeah, I think given the relative issues South Africa has with corruption being of a far greater magnitude than in the United States, it's far easier for Russia to use its standard playbook of electoral interference here, both in South Africa, of course. So it seems very plausible. At the same time, does the ANC following Russian demands necessarily help it electorally? This is a different question. So why, if Russia, and there is of course the evidence of significant amounts of Russian funding that goes to the ANC, is that to influence South Africa's foreign policy or behavior towards Russia, or is it purely just to keep the ANC in power because that is what Russia sees as useful? And arguably a more unstable South Africa would be more useful to Russia than perhaps just a perennially ANC ruled South Africa.
So, Krista, we've seen the ANC scrambling since Ambassador Brigady's announcement. We've seen, first of all, the appointment of the Commission of Inquiry. They took a few weeks to go find a judge that they could dust off to appoint. I don't know if it's going to be a credible Commission of Inquiry. We've had a few that have been very dubious, and certainly some that have been less dubious but have never been acted on. We've seen a hurried call arranged between Ramaphosa and Zelensky, hadn't spoken for over a year, so suddenly there was a hurried call. We've seen the Ukrainian ambassador who's been spurned by the ANC suddenly invited to Latuli House, and you just have to look at the body language of that to see how uncomfortable she was to be there, given the fact she knew she was there as part of a show and tell exercise. And we've also seen, for example, South Africa wanting to join this African peace mission. between Ukraine and the United States. Is this all too little too late, or could this help in mitigating against what we've been through?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what it's going to, how that's going to help kind of patch. I think that U.S.-South Africa relations have historically, kind of relied on strong personal relationships between, key political leaders. You had this with Mandela and Bill Clinton. Like I said, I think it was very strategic and very kind of intentional that President Ramaphosa was invited to, meet with President Biden, and maybe that relationship will be, kind of strong enough or important enough to kind of keep everything together here. But I wonder, I mean, the question that you were raising, and that Jakkie and Tom were also talking about as well. I do also wonder if, because Ambassador Brigety, of course, made this very public press statement, and I wonder if they were, obviously that was intentional, but to kind of throw this out into the public sphere, right? So to get a debate occurring in South African, sectors and corners around all of these issues that we're talking about. Is the ANC in bed with Russia and the Russians, and all of these other things? But what's also fascinating to me, or kind of puzzling to me, I guess, a little bit, is that then it feels as though the U.S. at least, I mean, it's interesting. You're absolutely right. You've had all of these kind of strategic, show and tells, if you will, right? But then the U.S. seems to also have just kind of retreated. It's as though we've kind of ceded that terrain. He came out, Ambassador Brigety came out and gave his apology, and then it was as though they, walked off stage. I mean, I think he has also, I think, had some, high level meetings, and then hopefully those will be more productive. I think that's the way to go, right? I mean, I think that was the way to go probably from the beginning, right? Kind of try the diplomatic avenue. So I'm hoping that is happening even now between Ambassador Brigety, because as I think somebody else, Jakkie was saying, my sense is, or my understanding is, that Ambassador Brigety was quite warmly received in South Africa, right? And the perception was that this was going to be a nice, change from the Trump administration, and kind of a policy which certainly, didn't, wasn't particularly favorable to South Africa. So I think people were hopeful, and hopefully, it was really, I'm sure South Africans felt in some ways very, kind of put off by him coming out and saying this, but maybe they can renew using the diplomatic channels to make some progress here.
Yeah, I think Brigety has been quite frustrated in South Africa actually for quite a while, and he was in a sense itching at the leash a little bit, and then went a little bit overboard. I do think. I say again that, so and I think the subsequent fallout wasn't, I don't know, but wasn't really foreseen by either side. But it has certainly exposed South Africa and our foreign policy. We can't make a choice. Our economy is tied to the West. Politically, the ANC is tied to BRICS, and ideologically, of course, very single-minded. But we need to balance our interests, and South Africa is not balancing its interests at the moment. We're coming across as foolish, as incompetent, and most important of all, we are harming our domestic economic prospects, and we are selling out when it comes to the basic tenets that is enshrined in our constitution. So it's not a matter of a choice. It's not that we need to sort of move from Russia now to align ourselves with the US, but we need to balance these relationships, and we're not doing that.
So we've got about 15 minutes left of this evening, and let's talk about what we do in those 15 minutes. I know how I want to end. I want to end with you all giving us advice on how we solve this problem. What do we do different, and what do we do better? That's how we're going to end. We're going to go next on to some questions from people that people have posed. And because I think there are lots of questions, Tom, there, I see there's a question. Who are the Wagner Group? What are they? Please give us an explanation. Jakkie, I know there's a question that's come up to say, it looks like BRICS wants to include Iran. That's a question from Mark. What does that do? Because does that not just create a group of pariahs who the West will actively go and oppose. What does that alignment look like? Please, if you're watching us on YouTube, on Facebook, or on Zoom, please pose questions to us now. We'd love to include you in the audience. But before we go on to the questions, Jakkie, a quick question. We've now got a commission of inquiry. We've got a retired judge. We've got one of the evidence presenters from the Zondo Commission, and we have a politician, an ex-deputy minister. Is this a credible commission of inquiry? Will there be a cover-up, or are we going to get to the truth?
I don't believe there will be a cover-up. I mean, what could happen is that certain evidence is just not being produced. But this is not, for all his faults, President Ramaphosa is not Jacob Zuma. I believe his heart and his orientation is in the right place. I would believe that the Commission of Inquiry would be credible. Like everything in the Ramaphosa administration, it takes 20 times longer than it should. Something that could have been dealt with is not. And we will have another commission which will come up with recommendations which won't be appointed, which won't be implemented. No, I won't question the credibility of the Commission of Inquiry. There have been many, and with one or two exceptions under Zuma, they have been credible.
So Krista, it's an interesting place in South Africa at the moment because we still have thousands of people watching us across YouTube, Zoom, and Facebook, even though half the country will be in darkness this evening, and the rest of those people will catch up tomorrow and the next day on YouTube. That's, luckily I have inverters and trolley inverters and my lights are in, but outside there's a world of darkness over here. But let's start with some of those questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section, in the chat section, on Facebook, on Zoom and on YouTube. And Tom, just clarify for us, what is this? And let's do very short questions and answers. What is this Wagner Group that people talk about?
The Wagner Group is officially a private military company that is, in fact, basically a giant, plausibly deniable private army run by the Russian, the military intelligence branch, GRU, and has global operations, particularly in Africa, but also in the Middle East, and to a limited degree in Venezuela. And its role is to effectively allow Russia to exert military power overseas and to influence elections, etc., via subsidiary companies, but always with the aim of plausible deniability. And it has subsequently been used in the war in Ukraine as a means of effectively hiding casualties from the Russian public, because it's extensively used convicts, to the extent that Russian convict contracts became the majority of Wagner's forces. And then simultaneously, it has allowed Russia to effectively use these troops in human wave attacks, i.e. as totally disposable and inconsequential absorbers of Ukrainian munitions, and thus not important to the casualty count in terms of how the Russian public view the casualties caused by the war.
So, Jakkie, the question that we had, if we expand BRICS and we start including countries like Russia, those who are actively opposing Western interests, while we may passively oppose Western interests, what happens to us and what happens to BRICS?
So let's simplistically say that the world consists of three groupings. There's the G7, there's the BRICS, and then there's the larger non-aligned grouping. That larger non-aligned grouping and the BRICS are growing in importance and economic weight. But unfortunately for supporters of China and Russia, the reality is, if you look at forecasting of power and influence, the West will continue to dominate, because for a variety of reasons, and we've actually done quite a bit of work on this. So yes, power is shifting, influence is shifting, the world is more complicated, relations are so on, but for the dollar will remain dominant for several decades probably still, and the West economically and technologically will remain top dog. And remember that even if you look at China, which will, as I've said previously, become the largest economy and overtake the US over the years ahead, it is isolated because it faces the same problems in a certain sense as the US, which is giantism and hegemonic influence. But the difference, of course, is that China and Russia, many of the countries you've mentioned, they are not democracies. They are not people. Whatever you think of the US and France and the UK and so on and so forth, there is domestic accountability. That is not the case in China or in Russia. You cannot compare these systems. Yes, countries like Russia and China and so on exert power and influence, but you don't see people exactly trying to move to Russia or to China. Quite the reverse. Where do Africans want to move to? Where do they look to when they look at the orientations, political orientations that they want? They look towards the West because they want the human rights, the democracy, the freedoms that are reflected there. And these are built into South Africa and into our constitution. Had it not been for that, we would have been in very deep trouble. But in South Africa, the judiciary and the independent newspaper outlets, civil society have stood. And that has saved us from significant damage. Next year, we're going to have elections, and we'll see what happens. I'm quite sure the ANC will lose its national majority, but it will still govern probably until 2029. But we will also see the same shift that happened in the rest of Africa when liberation parties over time were replaced normally by labor movements, parties imbued in. Those shifts, not in the same way, are also going to start happening in South Africa. And we need a substantive political change in South Africa if we are to resolve our other challenges. We need to return to the visions that the ANC originally stood for, which I'm afraid the ANC no longer stands for.
So, Jakkie, Sarah Gon wants to know, why do we need a commission of inquiry? Why doesn't the president pick up the phone and say to the Minister of Defense what actually happened?
That's actually the thing that worries me, because it's as if the president is saying there is something here that needs deeper investigation. And that's what worries me, because if it was simply a fact, already the Minister of Defense has said, I won't use her words, but that nothing was on, that no arms were loaded.
No, use her words, use her words. No one would understand what those words mean. They're in Afrikaans.
Fuck all. Which, in any case. So that's what worries me. Apparently there were discussions between the US and the presidency, and after that the Commission of Inquiry was established. So who knows, there may be smoke where there's a smoke and maybe there's a fire. So that does worry me. I'm not worried about the credibility of the commission. But had it simply been a question of looking at what the NCACC, the National Conventional Arms Control Committee, had allowed, given a license for, then Ramaphosa could just have said, that is it. But there is something there. I think that maybe the commission will come out, and then, you know, in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time, maybe the ANC will implement the recommendations.
So, Tom, Arthur Douglas wants to know, Jakkie seems to be painting the world ultimately in an Asia West non-aligned, genuinely non-aligned, not notionally non-aligned, people who just don't care. They just want to, countries that just want to get on and progress in life. Is China the ultimate winner from a weakened Russia, from the war and this international splitting up? Does China gain supremacy because its major rival on its borders is suddenly weakened?
It's complex, obviously. In terms of, obviously, as the world gets more multilateral, the way that other countries can, of course, deal with China becomes more dynamic. So things like Belt and Road have already begun to decline since COVID, a lot of criticism of the way China conducted itself then. Arguably, if we look at Xi's objectives for this decade, and the way that the Communist Party and the Chinese military elite are thinking, the major issue is the fact that there's a democratic China on their doorstep, Taiwan. So what Russia has done has arguably wakened up the West as a military bloc and made it go, oh my God, we don't have the arms capabilities, the munitions production levels we once had in the Cold War. We need to prepare for if China in fact invades Taiwan, as it indicates it, from a Chinese perspective, is within its rights and it intends to do so. So arguably China has benefited from becoming aware that it's not quite as easygoing and in its favor as perhaps it assumed in 2019. I'm not really sure, again, a weak Russia in the long run is a good thing for China, because it means that all Chinese, well, all Western hostility, if you like, to threats to Western hegemony, and however you want to view it, will be focused on China. China becomes the only peer level threat to the Western defense architecture. And in which case, hence you've seen the UK has increasingly in the last couple of years indicated a pivot to Asia and the sending of aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Strait. Everything is basically going, we realize Russia is no longer a conventional military threat. And in fact, all it's managed to do is expand NATO in this war. We can all look a bit further and focus on the threat that China poses. And so China is actually probably beginning to regret the fact that Russia has blown it up in its face far earlier than it would have liked.
So we're going to close our last few minutes of this webinar by asking for solutions. Let us presume, Krista, that you are president for the day. How do you get us out of this mess? And I'm going to ask each of the panelists, but at the same time, I'm going to ask each of the people watching us this evening to post their solution in the comment section as well, because I think the more people we can have who are giving solutions to the problem, how do we get our economy back on track? How do we get our currency back on track? How do we get our credibility back as a nation? And so, Krista, President Krista.
Oh, I like that. That has a nice sound to it, doesn't it? No, I wouldn't go into politics. Well, I'll pick up on something what Jakkie was saying, just in terms of, you know, the how, as I was saying, that really U.S. South Africa international interests tend to be oftentimes or frequently misaligned, but our domestic politics or our domestic interests in terms of the kind of political system, right, that South Africans want to live under is actually much more aligned with the West in terms of our values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But interestingly, Jakkie, I would also argue, and then also, I mean, because I'm not in South Africa, I'm curious what you all make of this data, because it's interesting. We know from the Afrobarometer data that continental wide, Africans support democracy like 80%. It's some of the most democracy supporting, you know, publics that there are in the world. But when you drill down and go to South Africa, it's actually now only 40%. And you all know that number has plummeted, really, you know, since 1994. And what does that then tell us? Well, I think in terms of a solution, sorry, I'm getting to my solution, Howard. So I think kind of part of the solution is that, you know, democracy can't be just, and this is a message that the US has to learn. You know, it can't just be about values and human rights and LGBTQ rights and, you know, all of the rest of that. It has to be also about development, right? And I think that we have to, you know, kind of be, and I think that's a winning message for the United States. I think that's a winning message. You know, as I was saying before, surely we know how to help South Africa address the energy crisis. You know, surely we have resources, and we even come up with these great projects like Power Africa and all of the rest of that. I mean, I think the way to really, you know, be able to address some of these, you know, kind of ongoing international relations tensions, and certainly between U.S. South Africa relations, would be to be much more proactive in terms of, you know, it's kind of like PEPFAR. PEPFAR was hugely successful, but it delivered. It was something that was actually tangible, that was right there. I think we need to do something, you know, something bold like that again.
Cool, fantastic. Tom?
I think in the short term, the dropping of comradely messaging in favor of Russia for no real gain would be an obvious boon to South Africa's relations with the rest of the world. I mean, I think obviously the issue is that in many ways, South Africa has elements of a very advanced economy that are totally integrated with the Western economy. Yeah, just look at the defense industry as a prime example, where it's often part owned by European companies. Longer term, South Africa is in a fantastic position in terms of being on the east-west highway, if you like, with total accessibility to Western cultural norms and democratic standards, at least in its constitution, and understanding how the economy works. But like somewhere like Australia, has extremely valuable natural resources that allow for quite a dynamic economy in its own right. So were I president and was seeking to solve all these things, the answer is to basically take, yes, a moderate international position, perhaps that is friendly with China as much as with the West, but continues to adhere to Western norms and seeks to perhaps fix the, I mean, broadly speaking, infrastructural challenges, I think, would be the first thing for South Africa. If you can fix the rail system, the roads, ESCOM, if I could solve those things, I'd be president for life, I'm sure. So I'd start there.
We may have to give you citizenship first. You'll have to go knock on your parents' and grandfather's doors in Brits to see if we'll have you back. So, Jakkie, that means the final word on solutions is in fact yours. Help us out of our quandary.
Thanks very much. I feel very honored to be president for a day. I think surely the number one priority is just to lower the temperature, particularly on the BRICS visit. We've got to find a way of making sure that Putin does not come to South Africa. It's going to just blow everything up. Whether we move the visit somewhere else, we are a member of BRICS. BRICS is important for South Africa, but we need to lower the temperature on this issue and rebuild our relations with our important trading partners, which includes China. But it certainly also includes the UK, the US, and a variety of others, which are also the most important investors in South Africa. And then we need to focus on turning our economy around, and that really is a question of management and competency, perhaps even more than it is of corruption. Ultimately, I personally don't think that is possible without substantive political change in South Africa, because in a sense, the ANC has been in power since 1994. It originally did exceptionally well, but certainly starting with Zuma, things have really not gone well. So political change, exercising our rights, and investing in the real drivers of change, which is not Black economic empowerment, it's investing in education and health and the drivers of growth and excellence. And if we can turn those things around over time, I think South Africa, once it focuses on its natural market, which is Southern Africa, has a competitive advantage. It is the market that globally is going to grow, and South Africa is in a huge position to benefit from that, and that's where we should focus our energies.
Well, you know, as I said before, our problems are human-made. They can be human-solved. And that's the greatest benefit that we really have. To our guests this evening who have joined us from around the world, I'm just so enormously grateful. When I suggested to people that we talk about South African foreign policy, the first reaction is, are you crazy? No one's interested in foreign policy. And I think we've proved tonight that there are thousands and thousands of South Africans who realize that our foreign policy in this country has meaning in their lives, has meaning for our economy, has meanings for our currency, has meanings for our alignment and how we see when we travel beyond our borders and how people relate to us. And we have to be a lot more sophisticated in the way that we deal with the world, because if we're not, we're going to bear the consequences. And I think Ambassador Brigety taught us a very important lesson. And that lesson was there are consequences to action. And we think we can get away with anything in the country because we treat the people in this country as if there are no consequences. We deny them electricity, we deny them healthcare, we deny them water, and the people of South Africa just take it. Well, the rest of the world isn't like that. And that's a very important lesson that I think Ambassador Brigety taught us. So to Professor Johnson, sitting in Washington, D.C., a huge thank you for giving out a big chunk of your day. To Jakkie Cilliers, you're South African, so I think you owe it to us, but I so appreciate the fact that you gave part of your Swedish, beautiful sunlit evening to join us this evening. And Tom, we'll give you back your passport because I know you love the game reserve more than anything else. So I look forward to seeing you all back in South Africa sooner rather than later. To our amazing audience who watched us this evening, thank you for being part of this conversation, and thank you for suggesting solutions as well. We're going to leave the chat up for the next few minutes so you can continue to offer us some solutions. We'll see you again on Sunday evening, where we have Nancy Spielberg, Steven Spielberg's little baby sister, joining us. She's going to be talking about movie making, and she's an international award-winning documentary producer and director. She's going to be talking about movies, and we're going to be showing Above and Beyond, her award-winning movie about the Israeli Defense Force. Thank you all. Good night to you all. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.